A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The summons came on a Thursday afternoon, when the autumn leaves were turning the color of old blood, and the wind carried the scent of approaching winter. Which seemed fitting because everything in Celine Ashwood's life was about to die, starting with her freedom and ending with whatever foolish dreams she'd harbored about choosing her own destiny. She'd been in the greenhouse when her father's messenger found her, a young beta named Thomas, who couldn't meet her eyes as he delivered the message that Alpha Rowan Ashwood required his daughter's presence in his study immediately. And the way he said immediately made her stomach twist with the kind of dread that comes from knowing, just knowing deep in your bones, that whatever was waiting for her behind that heavy oak door was going to change everything forever. Celine had wiped the soil from her hands with deliberate slowness, taking extra time to clean under each fingernail, while Thomas shifted nervously from foot to foot. And she'd studied the herbs she'd been transplanting, the delicate green leaves and the earthy smell of growth and life, wondering if this would be the last peaceful moment she'd have for a very long time. And that thought had made her chest tight with an anxiety she couldn't name, but felt everywhere. Like her own skin had become too small to contain all the fear trying to claw its way out. The walk from the greenhouse to her father's study took 7 minutes and felt like 7 hours, each step heavy with the weight of anticipation and the certainty that nothing good ever came from formal summons delivered by nervous messengers who refused to look you in the eye. And Celine found herself noticing everything with the hyper-awareness of someone trying to memorize a place they might never see again. The way the afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees and painted golden patterns on the ground. The sound of children laughing somewhere in the distance as they played without a care in the world. The smell of bread baking in the packhouse kitchen that made her realize she hadn't eaten since breakfast and probably wouldn't have an appetite for whatever came next. Her long silver hair, which had always marked her as different, as other, as something the pack whispered about in tones that mixed awe with suspicion, hung loose down her back in waves that caught the light and seemed to glow with their own inner luminescence, and she'd caught several pack members staring as she passed, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and something that looked disturbingly like pity, which only made the knot in her stomach pull tighter until she felt like she might be sick right there on the worn path that led to the Alpha's residence. The study door was closed when she arrived, and Celine stood outside it for a long moment, with her hand raised to knock, gathering what courage she could find in the hollow space where her confidence used to live back before she'd learned that being different meant being valuable only as a commodity, only as something to be used and traded and negotiated away to the highest bidder or the most desperate cause. She knocked 3 times, the sound echoing in the hallway like a death knell, and her father's voice called for her to enter, the tone already defeated and tired in a way that made her realize this conversation was going to be even worse than she'd imagined, and she'd imagined it being pretty catastrophic. When she pushed open the door, she found her father seated behind his massive desk that had belonged to her grandfather and his father before him. The wood scarred with decades of pack business and difficult decisions, and he wasn't alone because 3 council members occupied the chairs arranged in front of the desk like judges at a trial. And they all turned to look at her when she entered, their faces grave and uncomfortable, the kind of uncomfortable that came from knowing they were about to ruin someone's life and feeling bad about it, but not bad enough to actually stop it from happening. Alpha Rowan Ashwood looked like he'd aged 10 years since Celine had seen him at breakfast that morning, new lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth, his shoulders slumped under the weight of whatever decision had already been made, because she could tell from the way he wouldn't meet her gaze that this wasn't a discussion or a consultation, but a pronouncement, a done deal, a fait accompli that she was just being informed about as a courtesy before her life was packed up and shipped off to whatever fate they'd bartered her into. He gestured to the empty chair facing his desk, and Celine sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, channeling every ounce of composure she possessed, because she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. Not yet. Not until she was alone, where no one could witness her breaking into pieces too small to ever put back together. Her father cleared his throat twice before he could speak, and when the words finally came, they were rough and halting, like each syllable cost him something, though not enough apparently to change his mind about whatever fresh hell he was about to condemn her to in the name of pack survival and political necessity. The pack was failing, he told her in a voice that tried to be gentle, but came out hollow and rehearsed, as if he'd practiced this speech in front of a mirror until he could deliver it without completely breaking down. And Celine listened as he laid out their desperate situation in clinical detail that somehow made it worse, more real, more inescapable than if he'd just been blunt about it from the start. 3 years of failed harvests had depleted their food stores to dangerous levels, leaving them dependent on trade with neighboring packs, who charged increasingly extortionate prices for basic supplies because they knew desperation when they smelled it, and desperate wolves made terrible negotiators. The rogue attacks had increased in frequency and boldness over the past 18 months, targeting their borders and their patrols with a coordination that suggested someone was organizing them, someone with resources and intelligence and a grudge against the Ashwood Pack specifically, and they'd lost 12 wolves in the last year alone, which might not sound like much to larger packs, but represented a devastating percentage of their already dwindling fighting force. And then there were the debts, because apparently her father had borrowed heavily from 3 neighboring packs to cover the shortfalls and the funeral costs and the emergency supplies. And those debts had come due with interest rates that would make a loan shark blush, and the repayment terms that were quite literally impossible to meet given their current resources, which meant they were facing annexation at best and complete dissolution at worst, with their territory carved up and distributed among their creditors and their pack members scattered to whatever packs would take them in, if any would take them in at all. Celine sat there absorbing this litany of disaster and wondering why she was being told all this now. What possible role she could play in any of it, beyond being another mouth to feed and another liability in a pack that apparently couldn't afford either. And then her father's eyes finally met hers, and she saw the answer there before he even said it. Saw the guilt and the resignation and the terrible calculus that had convinced him this was the only way forward, the only solution to an impossible problem, the only card left to play when you'd already gambled everything else and lost. There was a way out, he said, and his voice cracked on the word way like it wanted to be something else entirely, something more honest like sacrifice or betrayal or selling. And Celine's hands clenched in her lap hard enough that her nails bit into her palms through the fabric of her dress. Because she knew, oh goddess, she knew what was coming, and it was somehow worse than anything she'd imagined during that long walk from the greenhouse. Alpha King Kiros Silverclaw of the Northern Territories had offered them a deal, her father continued, and the name alone made everyone in the room shift uncomfortably, because everyone knew that name. Everyone had heard the stories. Everyone whispered about the Blood King who'd carved his kingdom out of chaos and defended it with ruthless efficiency and legendary brutality that left his enemies as warnings and his allies as grateful witnesses to what happened when you crossed him. Kiros would eliminate all of the Ashwood Pack's debts, would provide military protection from the rogue attacks, would send food and supplies for the next 5 years to help them rebuild and recover. And all he wanted in return was a single thing. One simple request that made Celine's blood run cold, even as, Some distant part of her mind noted the bitter irony that she'd finally become valuable to her pack. Just not in any way she'd ever wanted or imagined or could have possibly prepared herself for. He wanted a bride, her father said, and specifically, he wanted the silver-haired Omega from the Ashwood pack, which meant he wanted Selene, wanted her specifically and particularly, and by name, which raised so many questions that her mind couldn't process them all at once, but kept circling back to the most important one, which was why. Why would the most powerful Alpha King in the Northern Territories want her? Want someone he'd supposedly seen once at an interpack gathering 2 months ago, where she'd been serving drinks and trying to be invisible like she always did at these political functions. She tried to speak, tried to ask questions, tried to understand how this was happening and why, and what possible reason Kairos Silverclaw could have for demanding her specifically when he could have literally anyone, any Omega or Beta or even Alpha female from any pack in his territory, who would jump at the chance to be queen. And her father held up one hand to forestall her questions and told her there was more, because apparently the situation wasn't quite catastrophic enough yet and needed some additional horror to really drive home how completely and utterly trapped she was. The Alpha King's representative had been very clear that this was not a negotiation or an offer, but an ultimatum, except within 3 days, or the deal was off the table permanently and the Ashwood pack could face its ruin without any hope of reprieve or rescue. And oh yes, the representative had also made it clear that if Selene didn't arrive at the Northern Palace within a week of acceptance, if she tried to run or hide or refuse, Kairos would consider it a personal insult and an act of pack dishonor, and everyone in the room understood what that meant, even if no one wanted to say it out loud, that the Blood King didn't tolerate insults and his retribution would make their current problems look like minor inconveniences by comparison. Selene felt something inside her chest crack and splinter. Not her heart exactly, but something equally vital. Maybe her sense of self, or her autonomy, or her naive belief that she had any control over her own life. And she heard herself asking questions in a voice that sounded too calm, too rational, too disconnected from the screaming panic that was happening somewhere deeper where words couldn't reach. How old was he? She asked, because that seemed important somehow, and her father said 28, which meant he was 9 years older than her, 19 years, and had probably lived more lifetimes of violence and loss and hard decisions than she could even comprehend. Had he been married before? She asked, thinking about why a powerful king would need to bargain for a bride instead of just choosing from the undoubtedly hundreds of eager candidates, and her father shook his head. No, said the Alpha King had been too focused on consolidating his power and defending his kingdom to take a mate. But now that things were stable, he needed an heir and a Luna to help manage the political aspects of ruling, and apparently he'd decided that Selene fit whatever specific criteria he had in mind. Though what those criteria were remained a mystery that made her skin crawl with possibilities both mundane and terrifying. The council members chimed in then, their voices overlapping in their eagerness to convince her this was the right choice, the only choice, the choice that would save 300 pack members from death or displacement or dishonor. And wasn't that worth a little personal sacrifice? Wasn't that what being part of a pack meant? Putting the needs of the many above the wants of the individual. And besides, it wasn't like she had other prospects lined up, considering her unusual appearance and her age, and the fact that most wolves found her unsettling to be around for reasons they could never quite articulate, but had something to do with her silver hair and pale skin, and the way she seemed to look through people instead of at them. They painted it as an honor, a privilege, a chance to be queen of the most powerful kingdom in the north, conveniently leaving out the part where she'd be married to a man called the Blood King, a man whose reputation for violence and cold ruthlessness preceded him like a warning written in the corpses of everyone who'd ever opposed him, a man she'd seen exactly once from across a crowded room and remembered only as tall and silver-haired and radiating the kind of danger that made smart people keep their distance. Her father played his final card then, the one she knew he'd been saving, the one that was designed to break through any resistance or objections or desperate plans for refusal, and he'd brought up her mother, brought up Elena Ashwood, who died when Celine was 7 years old, died throwing herself between her daughter and a rogue wolf's fangs, died saving Celine's life without hesitation or regret. And he said, in a voice thick with manipulation masquerading as emotion, that Elena had sacrificed everything for her family, had given her life so that Celine could live. And now, Celine had a chance to honor that sacrifice by saving the family her mother had died protecting. It was a low blow, and they both knew it, weaponizing a dead woman's love and a child's guilt into a tool for coercion. But it worked anyway because Celine felt the truth of it settle into her bones like poison, felt the weight of 300 lives pressing down on her shoulders alongside her mother's ghost, felt the walls of her safe, small life closing in until there was no air left to breathe and no space left to run, even if running had been an option, which it clearly wasn't and maybe never had been. She asked for time to think, which was ridiculous because what was there to think about really? The choice had already been made by circumstances and desperation, and her father's poor decisions that had somehow become her responsibility to fix. But she asked anyway because she needed to be alone, needed to fall apart in private before she pulled herself back together and did what she'd always done, which was shoulder the burden and bear the weight and sacrifice herself on the altar of duty and pack loyalty and the crushing expectation that she should be grateful for the opportunity to save everyone by destroying herself. Her father gave her until morning, which was generous considering they only had 3 days total to respond, and she'd already wasted most of one, and he looked at her with something that might have been apology or might have been relief that she hadn't outright refused, and he said something about how proud her mother would be, which made Celine want to scream because her mother would be horrified. Her mother would burn down the world before selling her daughter to a dangerous stranger. But her mother was dead and couldn't object, and Selina was alive and couldn't refuse. Not really. Not when 300 lives hung in the balance and her own wants and fears and desperate need to control even one aspect of her own existence didn't seem to matter at all in the face of pack survival. She left the study in a daze, walked through the pack house without seeing anything, and found herself back at the greenhouse without remembering the journey, standing among her herbs and her plants, and her small, safe hobby that represented the only part of her life that had ever truly belonged to her. And she realized, with the kind of clarity that comes from absolute despair, that in 3 days she'd be leaving all of this behind, leaving her home and her pack and her grandmother and the only life she'd ever known, leaving to marry a man called the Blood King, who'd bought her like merchandise to solve his succession problem. And she wouldn't be coming back. Not really, not as herself. Because whoever walked into the Northern Palace as Kairos Silverclaw's bride wouldn't be the same person who left the Ashwood pack as a scared 19-year-old girl with silver hair and no choices and a future that had just been decided without her consent or input or even her basic agreement, just the understanding that sometimes being pack meant being sacrifice, and her time had apparently come due. The 3 days Celine had been given to prepare for her new life felt simultaneously like an eternity and like no time at all. Each hour crawling by with agonizing slowness, while somehow the deadline rushed toward her with the inevitability of an avalanche. Unstoppable and crushing, and capable of burying everything she'd ever been under layers of duty and obligation so thick she'd never be able to dig herself out again. She'd spent the first night after the meeting in her father's study, sitting at her bedroom window, watching the moon travel across the sky, while her mind spun in endless circles, trying to find some loophole or escape route or alternative solution that didn't exist, because the trap had already been sprung and she was caught in it as surely as if they'd put actual chains around her wrists and ankles. Except these chains were made of guilt and responsibility and the crushing weight of 300 lives that apparently mattered more than her own autonomy or happiness or basic right to choose who she bound her life to for whatever remained of her future. Sleep hadn't come that night, or if it had, it was so light and fitful that she couldn't remember it. And when dawn finally broke through her window in shades of pink and gold that should have been beautiful, but just felt like mockery, she'd made her decision, or rather, accepted that there'd never really been a decision to make at all. Just the illusion of choice that people offered to make themselves feel better about forcing someone into an impossible situation. She'd gone to her father before breakfast, found him in his study already, because apparently he hadn't been sleeping much either, and she'd told him in a voice that sounded nothing like her own that she would accept the Alpha King's proposal, would marry Kairos Silverclaw, would go to the Northern Palace and become his Luna and his queen, and whatever else he required of her. And the relief that washed over her father's face was so profound and so immediate that Celine felt something inside her harden and crystallize into a cold, sharp anger that she didn't have time to process, but tucked away somewhere deep to examine later when she wasn't busy being the perfect, sacrificial daughter. Her father had embraced her, had called her brave and selfless, and everything a pack member should be, had actually had tears in his eyes as he thanked her for saving them all, and Celine had stood there in his arms, feeling absolutely nothing, which was probably better than feeling everything, because everything would have been too much, would have broken her apart right there in his study, and she couldn't afford to break, not yet. Not when she still had to get through the next few days, and the journey, and the wedding, and the rest of her life shackled to a man whose reputation made grown warriors nervous and whose reasons for wanting her specifically remained frustratingly mysterious. The news spread through the pack like wildfire, and suddenly Celine found herself at the center of attention in a way she'd never experienced before, with pack members stopping her to express their gratitude and their admiration and their relief that she was saving them all, as if she'd volunteered for this instead of being cornered into it by circumstances and manipulation and the weaponization of her dead mother's sacrifice. Some of them looked at her with pity, and those were almost worse than the grateful ones, because at least the grateful ones could pretend this was a good thing, an honor, a fairy tale wedding to a powerful king, while the pitying ones recognized it for what it was, a transaction, a girl being sold to settle debts and secure protection, a sacrifice dressed up in wedding clothes and political necessity to make it more palatable to everyone who wasn't actually the one being sacrificed. Her cousin Damon had found her on the second day, cornered her near the pack house kitchens with that smile he wore when he was about to say something cruel disguised as concern, and he'd congratulated her on finally making herself useful to the pack, on finding a purpose that matched her unusual appearance, because clearly the moon goddess had made her strange-looking, specifically so she could catch the eye of a powerful but damaged alpha, who wanted a bride unusual enough to match his own dark reputation. The comments had stung more than Celine wanted to admit, particularly because there was a grain of truth buried in the malice, the acknowledgement that she'd spent 19 years being viewed as slightly cursed or touched by something unnatural. Her silver hair and pale skin marking her as other in a pack that valued conformity and normalcy and the comfortable predictability of knowing everyone fit into their proper place without complications. Daemon had gone on to say that he hoped the Blood King lived up to his reputation because maybe being married to a monster would finally give her something real to worry about instead of moping around the greenhouse, pretending that growing herbs was a meaningful contribution to pack life. And he'd walked away laughing before Selene could formulate a response that wouldn't have devolved into screaming or possibly violence, neither of which would help her situation or make the next few days any easier to endure. She'd stood there in the hallway with her hands shaking and her jaw clenched so tight her teeth hurt, and she'd realized with a sick sort of clarity that Daemon was jealous, actually jealous that she was being forced into a political marriage with a dangerous stranger, jealous of the attention and the perceived importance, and the fact that she was suddenly valuable in a way he'd never managed to be, despite all his posturing and ambition and desperate attempts to be noticed by the pack leadership. Her grandmother Miriam had been the only person who'd treated the situation with any real honesty, who'd sat with Selene in her small cottage at the edge of pack territory and let her cry without offering empty platitudes or trying to convince her this was anything other than what it was. A terrible situation with no good options that Selene was handling with more grace and courage than anyone had any right to expect from a 19-year-old being shipped off to marry a stranger. Miriam had held her while she sobbed out all the fear and anger and grief for the life she'd thought she might have. The simple dreams of maybe finding a kind mate within the pack someday. Someone who'd see past her unusual appearance to the person underneath. Someone who'd want her for herself and not for political advantage or pack necessity or whatever inexplicable reason had motivated the Blood King to demand her specifically. When the tears finally stopped and Selene was left hollow and exhausted, Miriam had pulled back and looked at her with those sharp, knowing eyes that seemed to see through all pretense and protection to the truth hiding underneath, and she'd told Selene something that had lodged in her chest like a splinter, working its way deeper every time she thought about it. There was a legend, Miriam said in that storytelling voice she used when she was imparting something important, something that needed to be remembered and carried forward, about silver-haired wolves and what they represented in the old times before packs became political entities, and wolves forgot that they were connected to something older and more primal than territory disputes and trade agreements. Silver hair, according to the ancient stories, marked those chosen by the moon goddess for great destinies, not as victims or sacrifices, but as catalysts, as wolves who would change the fate of packs and kingdoms through their actions and their choices and their willingness to stand at the crossroads of history and push it in a new direction. The silver-haired wolves in the legends weren't weak or cursed or marked for tragedy. They were warriors and healers and leaders who possessed gifts that manifested when they were most needed, often in ways that no one, not even the silver-haired wolves themselves, could predict or control until the moment of crisis arrived and their true nature revealed itself in response to impossible circumstances. Selene had listened to this legend with skepticism and a bone-deep weariness that came from being told her entire life that her appearance meant something, that it marked her as special or cursed or blessed or dangerous depending on who was doing the interpreting. And she'd told her grandmother gently but firmly that she didn't feel like a chosen warrior or a catalyst for destiny. She felt like a scared girl being forced into marriage with a man who terrified her based on reputation alone, and no amount of ancient legends or mystical significance was going to change the reality of her situation. But Miriam had just smiled that sad, knowing smile and pressed a silver pendant into Selene's palm. A delicate moon symbol on a fine chain that had belonged to Selene's mother. And she'd said that whether Selene believed in the legends or not, the Blood King apparently did, Because why else would he have seen her once across a crowded room and decided she was the one he needed, the one he wanted, the one he was willing to negotiate for and wait for and specifically demand by name when he could have had anyone? The pendant was warm in Celine's hand, and she'd closed her fist around it, feeling the edges press into her palm. And she'd asked the question that had been haunting her since her father's revelation, the question no one else seemed to want to address, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging how strange and potentially sinister the whole situation was. Why did the Alpha King want her specifically? Want someone he'd barely seen and certainly didn't know? Want her enough to offer an incredibly generous deal to a failing pack just to secure her as his bride? And what did he know or think he knew or suspect about her that made her valuable enough to bargain for? Miriam hadn't had an answer, or if she did, she wasn't sharing it. But she'd told Celine to keep her eyes open and her mind sharp, to remember that she was an Ashwood, and Ashwoods were survivors, and to trust that the moon goddess didn't make mistakes, even when her plans looked like disasters from the ground level, where confused and frightened wolves were trying to make sense of forces they couldn't fully comprehend. The packing had been a surreal experience, trying to fit 19 years of life into 2 travel bags, while knowing that most of what defined her, her greenhouse and her herbs and her safe, small routines, couldn't be packed or transported or recreated in whatever cold, imposing palace she'd be living in for the rest of her life. She'd carefully selected her mother's journal, the one Elena had kept when she was Celine's age, filled with thoughts and dreams and observations about pack life that had helped Celine feel connected to the mother she barely remembered. And she'd packed the few dresses she owned that didn't make her look like she was drowning in fabric. And she'd filled one entire bag with seeds and cuttings from her most precious plants, a ridiculous gesture of optimism or possibly denial that suggested she might have the opportunity or the peace of mind to start a new garden in her new life. Her best friend Lissa had come to help, or really to cry, and ask questions that Celine couldn't answer about whether she'd ever come back to visit, and whether she'd write letters, and whether she was absolutely terrified of marrying the Blood King. And Celine had comforted her while simultaneously wanting to scream that of course she was terrified. She was being sent to marry a man whose nickname literally referenced his reputation for violence, but screaming wouldn't help anything. So she'd kept her voice calm and her hands steady, while her insides churned with anxiety that felt like broken glass in her stomach. The morning of departure had arrived with the same indifference that mornings always showed to human suffering. The sun rising and the birds singing and the world continuing to turn, regardless of the fact that Celine's entire life was about to be permanently altered in ways she couldn't predict or control. She'd dressed in her nicest traveling clothes, deep blue that made her silver hair look even more striking, and she'd braided that hair into a crown around her head because it felt like armor somehow. Like if she looked put together and dignified, she might feel that way internally, even though she mostly felt like she was drowning in terror and grief, and a resignation so complete it had become its own kind of numbness. The pack had gathered to see her off, which was both touching and horrible, because it meant she had to say goodbye in front of an audience, had to maintain her composure, while 300 faces watched her walk away from the only home she'd ever known. And she'd accepted their well wishes and their blessings and their gratitude with a smile that felt like it might crack her face in half if she held it much longer. Her father had embraced her at the gates, had whispered something about making him proud and honoring the family and being strong. And Celine had pulled away from him with a coldness she hadn't known she possessed, and told him that she hoped the price he'd gotten for her was worth it, that she hoped 300 lives and political security were adequate compensation for selling his only daughter to a stranger, and she'd had the bitter satisfaction of seeing him flinch before she turned away and climbed into the carriage that was waiting to transport her to her new life. The carriage was nicer than anything she'd ever ridden in, clearly sent by the Alpha King as a gesture of something, respect or possessiveness, or maybe just the basic courtesy of not making his future bride walk for 5 days through increasingly harsh terrain. And it was occupied by 4 of Kiros's elite guards, all of them enormous and intimidating in their silver armor, all of them wearing expressions of professional neutrality that made it impossible to know what they thought about their assignment or about her, or about anything beyond their obvious competence and lethal capability. The journey had been long and uncomfortable, despite the relative luxury of the carriage, and Celine had spent most of it staring out the window, watching the landscape change from the familiar rolling hills of Ashwood territory to the increasingly mountainous and forbidding terrain of the Northern Kingdom, and she tried not to think about the fact that every mile traveled was a mile farther from home, and a mile closer to a future she couldn't imagine and didn't want, but was going to have anyway, because apparently that's what happened when you were born with silver hair in a failing pack that needed a miracle and caught the attention of a powerful king with unclear motivations. The guards had been mostly silent, responding to her few attempts at conversation with monosyllabic answers that made it clear they were here to transport and protect her, not to be her friends or her confidants or her source of information about the man she was traveling to marry. Though one of them, Felix, had eventually softened enough to tell her that the Alpha King protected what was his with absolute ruthlessness, which was meant to be reassuring, but actually just raised more questions about what exactly she was going to be once she arrived. Protected possession, or valued partner, or something else entirely that she couldn't name, but felt vaguely sinister in its implications. They'd traveled through several territories, and Celine had watched the villages they passed with increasing interest, noting that despite the stories about the Blood King's tyranny, the territories under his control seemed well-maintained and prosperous, with solid buildings and well-fed children and guards who patrolled with the efficiency of people who knew what they were doing and took pride in doing it well. She'd overheard conversations in the villages where they stopped to rest and change horses, snippets of gossip and opinion about Kairos that painted a more complex picture than the simple monster narrative she'd been carrying in her head. Comments about how he'd ended the territory wars that had decimated the Northern Pacts for decades. How he was harsh but fair in his judgments. How he took care of his people even while terrifying his enemies. And she'd found herself thinking that maybe, possibly, there was more to the Blood King than his reputation suggested, though whether that more was better or worse remained to be seen. The Northern Palace had appeared on the afternoon of the 5th day, emerging from the mountain landscape like something out of a nightmare or possibly a fever dream, all stone walls and guard towers, and an imposing fortress quality that made it clear this was a place built for defense and power rather than comfort or beauty. And Celine's stomach had dropped somewhere around her knees as she realized this was going to be her home. This cold, forbidding structure that looked like it had never known warmth or softness, or any of the gentle things that made a place feel like somewhere you'd want to live rather than somewhere you'd want to escape from. The guards had escorted her through gates that were thick enough to withstand a siege, and into a courtyard that was full of more guards, all of them in that distinctive silver armor, all of them watching her with expressions she couldn't read, and she'd felt more like a prisoner arriving at a jail than a bride arriving at her new home, and the distinction between those two things was starting to feel uncomfortably thin. They'd taken her through hallways that seemed designed to intimidate, all stone and torches and weapons mounted on walls like trophies or warnings, and she'd been acutely aware of her travel-stained dress and her messy braid, and the fact that she probably looked exactly like what she was, a scared teenager who was in way over her head and trying desperately not to show it. The throne room doors had opened before her with a sound like thunder, and Celine had stepped through into an enormous chamber that seemed designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. And at the far end of that chamber stood a man who could only be Kairos Silverclaw, tall and broad-shouldered and radiating a dangerous intensity that made her earlier nervousness seem quaint and inadequate. Because this wasn't just a powerful alpha. This was something more primal and predatory and utterly terrifying in its controlled violence. He'd been speaking with another man when she entered, and he'd turned to look at her with eyes that were the color of winter storms. Silver like her hair, but harder, colder, sharper. Eyes that seemed to see through all her careful composure to the terror underneath. And for a long moment, they just stared at each other across the length of the throne room, while Celine's heart hammered so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. He'd dismissed everyone else with a gesture, and suddenly they were alone except for one guard by the door, and Kairos had started to circle her slowly, studying her like she was something he was considering purchasing and wanted to inspect for flaws. And Celine had forced herself to stand still and meet his gaze when he came back around to face her, because she would not cower, would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken, even if she felt like she was shattering into 1,000 pieces under the weight of his attention and his presence, and the reality of what her life was about to become. His first words to her, delivered in a voice that was surprisingly measured considering his reputation, were that she was younger than he remembered. And Celine had found her voice somewhere in the wreckage of her composure and told him she was 19, old enough to make binding decisions. And she'd seen something flicker in his expression. Surprise maybe that she'd spoken back to him instead of just agreeing meekly with whatever he said. The conversation that followed had been surreal, with Kairos circling her and making observations and asking questions in a way that felt like a test she didn't know the parameters of, and Celine had responded with more backbone than she'd known she possessed, defending her father even though she was angry with him, admitting that she'd chosen this to save her pack, even though chosen was a generous interpretation of what had actually happened. And somewhere in that exchange, she'd seen Kairos's expression shift from assessment to something that might have been respect, and she'd realized that he hadn't expected her to have any fight in her, had maybe expected a trembling girl who'd submit to whatever he demanded without question or resistance. He'd told her about the sleeping arrangements, that she'd have her own chambers connected to his by a door that would remain locked from her side until she chose to unlock it, that she wasn't required to fulfill any marital duties until she was ready. And the courtesy of that statement had shocked her into silence, because it suggested he had some concept of consent and autonomy, even in a political arrangement, which didn't fit at all with his reputation as a tyrant who took what he wanted without regard for others' feelings or wishes. She'd asked him why show her that consideration, and he'd said something about not forcing anyone even in political arrangements, and then he'd turned to leave and paused to tell her to keep her silver hair down and not hide it, which was the first indication that her appearance was significant to him in some way, beyond just aesthetic preference. And she'd gathered her courage and asked the question that had been burning in her mind since this whole nightmare began. Why had he chosen her specifically, she'd demanded to know, when he could have had anyone, any bride from any pack who would have been thrilled and honored to marry him regardless of his reputation? And Kairos had turned back to face her with an expression that was complex and layered and impossible to fully read in the torchlight of the throne room, and he'd told her something that had stopped her heart and stolen her breath and rewritten everything she'd thought she understood about this arrangement. When he'd seen her at that interpack gathering 2 months ago, she'd been the only one not afraid of him, the only one who'd looked at him like he was just another person, instead of a monster or a threat or a prize to be won. and he hadn't been seen as just another person in 12 years, not since he'd been forced to become the Blood King to survive and protect his kingdom and prove that he was strong enough to hold power in a world that viewed any weakness as an invitation for destruction. And in that moment, when their eyes had met across a crowded room for just seconds, he'd seen something in her that he'd been looking for without even knowing he was looking. Something that made him think maybe, possibly, she could see him as a person instead of a title, as Kairos instead of the Blood King. And that possibility had been valuable enough to negotiate for and wait for, and specifically demand, because he was so desperately tired of being alone inside a reputation that protected him while slowly suffocating everything human he had left. The revelation had hit Celine like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything she'd thought she understood about why she was here and what he wanted from her, and what kind of marriage this was going to be. And she'd stood there staring at him while her mind raced to process this new information. This suggestion that maybe she wasn't just a political acquisition, but something more personal, something he'd chosen not for strategic advantage, but for emotional survival, and the vulnerability implicit in that admission, from a man who showed vulnerability to no one, was staggering in its implications. Before she could formulate a response, before she could even begin to unpack what he'd just revealed and what it meant for both of them, the guard by the door had rushed forward with urgent news, his face pale and his words tumbling over each other in his haste to deliver them. And he'd said something that made Kiros's entire demeanor shift from open to closed, from vulnerable to dangerous. From the man who'd just admitted to loneliness to the Blood King who dealt with threats with legendary ruthlessness, and Celine had felt the moment slip away from them like water through her fingers, taking with it whatever fragile connection had been forming in the space between them. There'd been an attack on the eastern border, the guard reported with barely controlled panic. A coordinated assault by what appeared to be a coalition of rogue packs, and they'd specifically targeted the village where Celine's escort had stopped for supplies on their second day of travel. And there were reports of casualties and prisoners, and a message left behind that was clearly meant for Kiros. A declaration that not everyone accepted his rule or his right to import brides from failing packs, or his consolidation of power that had left too many alphas diminished and resentful. And the implication was clear that Celine's arrival had been tracked and noted and interpreted as a sign of either weakness or opportunity. And now someone was testing to see whether the Blood King would be distracted by his new bride, or whether he'd respond with the same brutal efficiency that had built his reputation in the first place. And Kiros's expression as he processed this information was terrifying in its cold calculation. All traces of the vulnerable man who'd admitted to loneliness burned away in the face of a threat that needed to be neutralized before it could spread into something larger and more dangerous. And he turned to Celine with eyes that were hard as diamonds and told her in a voice that allowed no argument that she was to go to her chambers and stay there until he returned. And he'd left her standing in the throne room before she could ask when he'd be back, or how dangerous this was, or whether he expected her to just wait passively while he rode off to deal with a threat that had been partially inspired by her arrival. And as the throne room doors closed behind him with a finality that felt like a door slamming on any hope of understanding or connection, Celine realized with a clarity that was almost painful that her new life was going to be far more complicated and dangerous than she'd imagined. And the man she'd just married in all but ceremony was both more human and more lethal than his reputation suggested. And she had no idea whether that combination was going to save them both or destroy everything they might have built together before it even had a chance to begin. The attack on the eastern border turned out to be both worse and better than initial reports suggested, which Celine learned from Elena Frost when the stern woman arrived at her chambers with food and an explanation delivered in a tone that suggested she didn't particularly care whether Celine wanted either, but was going to receive both anyway, because that's what happened when you became Luna of the Northern Kingdom. You got information and sustenance, whether you asked for it or not. The casualties had been lighter than feared because Kiros and his elite guards had arrived with the kind of speed that suggested they'd been halfway expecting an attack, which made Selene wonder uncomfortably whether her arrival had been used as bait or whether the threat had been anticipated for other reasons that no one had bothered to explain to her. And either possibility was disturbing in its own way, because it suggested layers of political maneuvering and strategic thinking that she was only beginning to glimpse the edges of. The rogues had been neutralized with what Elena described as typical efficiency, which Selene suspected was a euphemism for the kind of violence that had earned Kairos his reputation, and the message they'd left behind threatening destabilization and rebellion had been answered with a counter-message that apparently involved heads on spikes and declarations that anyone who tested the Blood King's patience would discover exactly how he'd earned that title. And Selene had felt sick hearing about it while simultaneously recognizing that this was the world she'd married into. A world where power was maintained through demonstrations of strength and mercy was viewed as weakness, and the cost of keeping thousands safe often meant being willing to make examples of those who threatened that safety. Kiros had been gone for 3 days, and in that time, Selene had been given a crash course in palace life by Elena and the household staff. Learning the layout of her new home and the expectations of her position and the careful political dance of being Luna to a king whose reputation preceded him into every interaction and colored every relationship with a mixture of fear and respect that made genuine connection nearly impossible. She'd discovered that her chambers, while technically separate from Kiros's, were actually part of a larger suite that had clearly been designed for a mated pair, with a sitting room that connected both bedrooms and a bathing room that could be accessed from either side. And the symbolism wasn't lost on her, that while he'd given her the option of locking the connecting door, he'd also made it clear that they were meant to share space and life and eventually intimacy, just on a timeline that allowed her some illusion of control over when that intimacy would begin. The palace staff had been cautiously welcoming, clearly waiting to see what kind of Luna she would be before committing to any real warmth or loyalty, and Selene had spent those 3 days trying to learn names and roles and the complex web of relationships that kept a place this size functioning, and she'd been surprised to discover that she was actually good at it, that her years of being observant and careful and learning to read people's moods and motivations in order to navigate her own pack's complicated social dynamics had given her skills that translated surprisingly well to managing a royal household. When Kiros finally returned, it was late evening, and Selene was in the library that she'd discovered on her second day, a massive room full of books and comfortable chairs that had quickly become her refuge from the overwhelming newness of everything else, and she'd been reading about Northern Kingdom history, trying to understand the context of the world she now inhabited, when she'd felt his presence before she'd heard him. Some instinct that she didn't quite understand, making her look up from her book to find him standing in the doorway, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He'd looked exhausted and still slightly dangerous, wearing travel-stained clothes and radiating the kind of coiled tension that suggested he'd been in combat recently, and his body hadn't quite processed that the immediate threat was over. And for a long moment, they just stared at each other across the library, while Selene's mind raced, trying to decide whether to ask if he was all right or whether that would be overstepping some boundary she didn't yet understand the parameters of. He'd broken the silence first, asking if Elena had explained what happened, and Selene had nodded and found her voice enough to say that she'd heard about the attack and the response, and she was glad he'd returned safely, which had made something shift in his expression, some of the dangerous tension easing into something that looked almost like surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to care whether he returned safely or not. And Selene had realized with a sudden clarity that he'd probably spent 12 years having no one care about his well-being beyond its political implications, and the simple human concern in her words had touched something he'd thought was dead. They'd talked for hours that night, Kairos settling into the chair across from hers and speaking with a frankness that suggested he'd decided she deserved honesty, even if that honesty was uncomfortable. And he'd told her about the political situation that had led to the attack, about the coalition of smaller alphas who resented his consolidation of power, and viewed his marriage to her as evidence that he was securing alliances through manipulation rather than maintaining control through strength alone. He'd explained that bringing her to the palace had been a calculated risk, knowing it might provoke exactly the kind of response it had provoked, but he'd decided the risk was worth it because he was tired of ruling alone, and tired of being surrounded by people who wanted something from him rather than being with him. And he'd seen in her someone who might, possibly, eventually, be able to distinguish between Kairos the man and the Blood King the title. Selene had listened to all of this with a growing understanding that the situation was far more complex than her father had presented it, that she hadn't been bought so much as chosen for reasons that were both political and deeply personal, and she'd asked him directly what he wanted from her beyond the political alliance and the eventual heir. What he was actually hoping to gain from this arrangement beyond the practical necessities. His answer had been delivered with a vulnerability that seemed to cost him something, and he'd told her that he wanted someone who would tell him the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Someone who would see him as a person, rather than as a weapon or a title or a solution to problems. Someone who could stand beside him not as a subordinate, but as a partner who brought her own strengths and perspectives to the enormous task of ruling a kingdom full of people who depended on them for safety and prosperity and justice. He'd admitted that he didn't know if she could be that person, didn't know if the circumstances that had brought her here would make genuine partnership impossible. But he was hoping that maybe if he gave her time and space and the freedom to choose whether to stay emotionally, even though she couldn't leave physically, she might decide that he was worth the risk of opening herself to someone whose reputation suggested he was incapable of the kind of emotional intimacy she deserved. The confession had settled into Selene's chest like a weight and a gift simultaneously, and she'd found herself telling him things she hadn't planned to reveal, about her own fears and doubts, and the anger she felt toward her father and her pack for putting her in this position, and about the strange, unexpected realization that maybe being forced into this arrangement had actually freed her from the constraints of her old life in ways she was only beginning to recognize and understand. The wedding ceremony 3 days later had been exactly as formal and political as promised, held in the palace chapel with only necessary witnesses and none of the celebration or joy that should accompany the joining of two lives. But something had shifted between them in those conversations in the library, some foundation of mutual respect and cautious trust that made the ceremony feel less like a prison sentence and more like the beginning of something that might, with time and effort and a willingness to be vulnerable despite every instinct screaming that vulnerability was dangerous, become something real and valuable, and worth the fear it cost to pursue it. When Kairos had taken her hand for the binding ceremony, and she'd felt that same strange warmth she'd felt on the carriage ride, stronger now and more insistent, she'd looked up into his silver eyes and seen the same awareness there. The recognition that something was happening between them that went beyond political arrangement or physical attraction, something that felt ancient and inevitable and terrifying in its implications. The priest had pronounced them mated, and Kairos had led her to the chambers that were now officially theirs to share, and he'd kept his word about the locked door and the choice and the timeline that would be hers to determine. but they'd talked through that door for hours that first night, their voices carrying through the wood and creating an intimacy that didn't require physical presence, just honesty and willingness to be known. The weeks that followed had been a strange dance of learning each other while navigating the demands of their respective roles, with Celine discovering that being Luna meant far more than she'd anticipated, required skills in diplomacy and management, and strategic thinking that she'd never been taught, but found herself developing out of necessity and surprising aptitude. Elena had become her mentor, and eventually something like a friend, teaching her how to read political situations and manage complex personalities, and wield the soft power of a Luna in ways that complemented rather than competed with Kairos's more direct approach to leadership. The elite guards had warmed to her gradually, won over by her genuine interest in their well-being and her willingness to learn, rather than demand respect based solely on title. And Felix had started calling her Lady Silver, with an affection that made her feel like maybe she was building something here, creating connections that went beyond obligation into actual belonging. Kiros had continued their evening conversations, sometimes in the library and sometimes in the sitting room they shared, and Celine had watched him slowly relax in her presence, the dangerous tension that seemed to be his default state easing into something more human when they were alone, and he didn't have to maintain the persona of the Blood King. The crisis that had been building on the eastern border escalated 6 weeks into their marriage, when the coalition of resistant alphas made another coordinated move, this time targeting supply routes and trying to isolate the Northern Kingdom from its trade partners, and Kiros had been preparing to ride out with his guards when Selena had done something that surprised both of them by insisting she come along, not to fight, but to help negotiate with the affected villages and demonstrate that the royal couple was united in protecting all territories under their rule. He'd argued against it initially, citing danger and protocol, and a dozen other reasons that boiled down to not wanting to risk her safety. And Celine had argued back with a fierceness she was still discovering in herself, pointing out that she wasn't a fragile ornament to be protected, but his Luna and his partner, and she had value beyond her ability to produce heirs. And if he wanted someone who would stand beside him and share the burden of leadership, then he needed to actually let her stand beside him instead of locking her away in the palace where she was safe but useless. The argument had been their first real fight, voices raised and frustrations aired and underlying fears exposed, and it had ended with Kiros looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time and agreeing that she could come but only if she stayed close to the guards and followed his instructions regarding safety. And Selene had agreed, while privately resolving to prove that she was capable of far more than anyone, including herself, had previously imagined. The journey to the Eastern Territories had given them time together outside the palace, away from the constant observation and political calculation that colored every interaction at court, and Selene had seen different aspects of Kairos's leadership as he'd worked with village elders and negotiated with merchants and personally inspected defenses with a thoroughness that suggested he took his responsibility for their safety seriously and personally. She'd contributed by meeting with families affected by the conflict, using her healing knowledge to help the injured and her natural empathy to comfort those who'd lost homes or loved ones. And she'd been surprised to discover that people responded to her with a warmth they didn't show Kiros, as if her presence gave them permission to be vulnerable in ways they couldn't be around the Blood King. One evening, around a campfire while the guards were setting up their defensive perimeter, Kiros had told her that watching her work with his people, seeing how she genuinely cared about their well-being and how they responded to that care with trust and affection, had made him realize what had been missing from his rule, the softer elements of leadership that he'd neglected in his focus on security and strength, and he'd asked her if she'd be willing to take on more of that role, to be the heart of their kingdom while he provided the backbone, and Celine had agreed while simultaneously pointing out that she'd need him to listen to her recommendations, even when they contradicted his instincts, and he'd promised he would try, which was more than she'd expected, and exactly what she needed. The attack came on their last night in the Eastern Territories, a desperate final gambit by the Coalition Alphas, who'd apparently decided that eliminating Kiros and his new Luna would create enough chaos to allow them to seize power. And it had been brutal and terrifying, and exactly the kind of situation Celine had no training for. But she'd discovered something in that moment of crisis. Something that her grandmother's legends had suggested might be there, but she'd never quite believed until circumstances forced it to manifest. When one of the rogues had broken through the guard perimeter and lunged directly at her with killing intent clear in his eyes, Celine had felt something awaken inside her. Some ancient power that responded to the threat with a force she didn't understand but couldn't control. And her voice had come out with alpha command, that rare ability that allowed certain wolves to compel obedience through sheer force of will, and the rogue had frozen mid-attack, forced to submit to an Omega who shouldn't have possessed that kind of power, but clearly did. The revelation had shocked everyone, guards and rogues and Kairos himself, and in the aftermath of the fight, when the remaining attackers had been subdued and the coalition's leadership structure had been dismantled through a combination of combat and strategic surrender, Kairos had looked at her with something that was equal parts awe and vindication, as if she'd just confirmed something he'd suspected but hadn't been sure of. And he'd said quietly that he'd known there was something different about her, something that went beyond her silver hair and her unusual appearance, some quality that marked her as exactly what he needed, even if neither of them had fully understood what that something was until it manifested under pressure. The journey back to the palace had been different, with Celine riding beside Kiros rather than in the protected center of the formation, a shift in position that symbolized her new status as true partner rather than precious cargo. And they'd talked about what had happened and what it meant and how her unexpected abilities would change the dynamics of their rule. That night, back in the palace and finally alone in their chambers, Celine had unlocked the connecting door between their rooms, not because she felt obligated or because enough time had passed, but because she'd made a decision, had chosen him not as the Blood King, but as Kiros, the man who'd been patient and honest and vulnerable with her, the man who'd given her space to discover herself and time to decide whether she could love someone whose circumstances had shaped him into something fierce and protective, and occasionally terrifying, but fundamentally honorable beneath all the armor and reputation. Their physical union that night had been tender and intense, and full of months of suppressed emotion and careful trust, finally allowed to manifest into something real. And when he'd marked her afterward, his teeth gentle on her neck, and the bond settling into place between them with a rightness that made her gasp, Celine had felt complete in a way she'd never experienced before, not because she needed him to be whole, but because they'd chosen each other freely, despite all the circumstances that had brought them together involuntarily, and that choice had transformed obligation into something precious. 2 years later, Celine stood in the palace gardens that she'd cultivated from the cold, practical space Kiros had maintained into something beautiful and warm and alive, holding their daughter who'd been born with the same silver hair that marked both her parents, and she thought about how far she'd traveled from that terrified 19-year-old who'd climbed into a carriage thinking she was being sent to her doom. The Northern Kingdom had transformed under their joint leadership, with Kairos providing the strength and security that kept threats at bay, while Selena developed programs for healing and education and conflict resolution that made people feel valued rather than just protected, and together, they'd proven that power could be wielded with both strength and compassion. That leadership could be fierce and kind simultaneously. That the Blood King could be both the warrior his kingdom needed and the man his mate deserved. When young wolves came to her seeking refuge or guidance, cast out from their packs for being different or unusual or not fitting into the narrow definitions of acceptable, Selene would tell them her story about being forced into a marriage that had terrified her, about discovering strength she didn't know she possessed, about choosing love despite fear and finding that sometimes the moon goddess arranged circumstances specifically to put you exactly where you needed to be, even if the journey to get there felt like punishment rather than blessing. She'd tell them that being different wasn't a curse, but a gift waiting to be unwrapped. That the qualities that made them seem strange or unsettling to others might be exactly what someone else needed. That strength came in forms beyond physical power, and that the softest heart could hold the firmest resolve when circumstances demanded it. She'd introduce them to Kiros, who'd learned to smile more easily and lead with slightly less isolation, who'd discovered that showing vulnerability to the right person didn't diminish his authority, but actually enhanced it by proving he was human rather than the mythical monster his reputation suggested. And together, they'd demonstrate that partnership could exist even in arrangements that began without choice, that love could grow in the strangest soil if you were brave enough to water it and patient enough to let it develop at its own pace, rather than forcing it into predetermined shapes that might look right but feel wrong. As Selene watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and red, while her daughter dozed in her arms and Kiros approached from the palace with that particular expression that meant he had news but wanted a moment of peace with his family first, she reflected that she'd been forced to wed the most feared Alpha King at 19 to save her pack from ruin, but that force had become choice, and that fear had transformed into love, and that salvation had gone both ways, with her saving her pack through sacrifice while simultaneously saving Kiros from the loneliness that had been slowly killing him, and saving herself from a small, safe life that would have never challenged her to discover who she truly was beneath all the assumptions and limitations that others had placed on her unusual existence. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, the worst thing that ever happened to you turned out to be the doorway to the best thing you never knew you needed. And the moon goddess's plans, mysterious and painful as they often were, had a way of working out exactly right for wolves who were willing to trust that their differences made them special rather than strange, that their circumstances didn't define their destinies, and that sometimes being forced into something was actually the universe pushing you toward something you would have been too afraid to choose for yourself, but would ultimately be grateful to have found. If you enjoyed Selene and Kiros's story, this tale of forced marriage that became fated love, of the Blood King who needed softness, and the silver-haired Omega who discovered her own fierce strength, please subscribe to this channel for more werewolf romance tales featuring powerful alphas, extraordinary omegas, and the unexpected bonds that transform lives and kingdoms alike, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload, because there are so many more stories waiting to be told about wolves who find each other in the strangest circumstances and prove that destiny sometimes wears the disguise of disaster. Leave a comment below telling me what you thought of this story. Which moment resonated most deeply with you? Whether it was Selene's decision to sacrifice herself for her pack, or Kiros's vulnerable admission about his loneliness, or the moment she unlocked that connecting door and chose him freely, or perhaps the revelation of her alpha command that proved she was never just an omega, but something far more powerful waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. And let me know what kind of werewolf stories you'd like to see next, because your support and engagement mean everything and help me create more content like this that explores the complexity of fated mates and chosen love. and the transformative power of two damaged souls finding healing in each other's arms. Thank you for reading. Thank you for being here. Thank you for following Celine's journey from sacrifice to sovereignty. And I'll see you in the next story, where more alphas and omegas and impossible situations await their own transformations from forced circumstances into fated destinies that prove the moon goddess always knows exactly what she's doing, even when her chosen wolves are still figuring it out for themselves.